It all started on a Thursday, a day just like any other. I had spent the entire afternoon at the office, staring at my screen, answering emails, attending meetings that dragged on longer than they should have. By the time I left for home, I was exhausted, my mind foggy, and my body craving rest. The familiar walk from work to my apartment was the only part of my routine I looked forward to. I took my usual route, a shortcut that cut through a small park just a few blocks away from my building. The air was crisp, typical for fall, the ground covered in scattered leaves. It wasn't too crowded at that hour, just a few people here and there, either sitting on benches or walking their dogs. Nothing unusual. But then, as I neared the park's edge, I saw it. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Just another person standing at the far end of the park, near the trees, facing away from me. It seemed like an odd place to stand still, but I thought little of it. I was tired, my thoughts focused on the dinner I was planning to make once I got home. Yet, something about the figure caught my eye, and I slowed my pace. There was a stillness about it, something that didn't fit. The figure didn't move at all, not even an inch. It was as if the person were frozen in place, perfectly aligned with the tree behind them. The way they stood seemed almost too perfect, too composed. I glanced at them, but I didn't make eye contact. It wasn't that kind of moment. I thought it was odd, but again, I dismissed it. Probably just someone waiting for someone else, I told myself. There was nothing sinister in the air, no sense of danger. Still, my heart rate picked up slightly, a slight sense of unease creeping in. As I passed by, I looked again, just to confirm my thoughts. The figure didn't move. It was almost like they weren't aware of the world around them. No one stood that still unless they were waiting for something, or someone, but no one else was nearby. I shook my head, feeling silly for even thinking anything was amiss. People had quirks. Maybe this person was waiting for someone, or maybe they were just caught in thought. So, I kept walking, not allowing myself to dwell on it. I reached my apartment, unpacked my bag, and began to prepare a simple dinner. But the image of that figure remained in the back of my mind. The way it stood there unmoving seemed almost too deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I tried to distract myself with a show on Netflix. My mind wandered, occasionally revisiting that moment, but I couldn't pinpoint why it bothered me. I was tired, overthinking things. I went to bed and fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion finally overtaking me. The next evening, I followed my usual routine, walking the same route home after work. I didn't think much of the figure anymore, assuming it had been a figment of my imagination or just a harmless quirk. Maybe it was just the stress of the day making me jumpy. But when I turned the corner near the park, I saw it again. There it was in the same spot. It was standing absolutely still, just like the night before. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that I had simply remembered it wrong, but no. The figure was there, exactly where I had seen it the night before. A sudden wave of unease washed over me. I stopped in my tracks for a moment, staring at it. I told myself to keep walking, to ignore it. People stand still all the time. It was just a coincidence, right? But something didn't sit right. The way the figure remained motionless, unblinking, unwavering. It wasn't just that it was still, it was the fact that it seemed too still, too perfect in its stance. I tried not to let my imagination run wild. But the air felt thicker now, charged with something I couldn't name. I began walking again, faster now, keeping my head forward, pretending I hadn't seen anything. The whispers were already starting, faint, just at the edges of my mind. The thought lingered, unwelcome, like a small pebble lodged under the skin. Why is it always standing there? I reached my apartment without incident, but the strange feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, an unease I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced out the window, I imagined I could see the figure standing there, watching me. The third day came, and I was determined to just let it go. I had no reason to feel this way. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, or maybe I was just looking for something to explain away my discomfort. But when I walked past the park, my pace slowed involuntarily. There it was again, exactly the same. Same spot, same posture, same lack of movement. A chill ran down my spine. I stood still, watching it for a moment, studying its every detail. It didn't shift. It didn't blink. It didn't even seem to acknowledge the world around it. I had never seen anything like it, not in real life. I could feel a knot of tension building in my chest. My hands were suddenly clammy. This wasn't just a person waiting for someone. There was something fundamentally wrong about it. But the more I stared, the more I felt the weight of something else, something indescribable. It wasn't the figure itself that unnerved me. It was the sense that something else was at work here. Something not tied to logic or reason. I quickly turned away, trying to suppress the unease growing within me, and picked up my pace. But my mind wouldn't stop. It kept looping back to the figure, to its stillness, to the feeling of being watched. That night, I decided to take a different route home, avoiding the park altogether. I told myself it was a fluke, that I was overthinking. But even as I walked down a new path, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still there, in the park, waiting for me. And that thought alone sent a shiver down my spine, that I woke up the next morning feeling strangely unsettled, as though I hadn't rested at all. The tension from the previous night lingered in my bones, and the memory of that still figure in the park hovered at the edges of my thoughts. I told myself it was just anxiety. The pressure from work, the monotony of my routine, had probably created an overactive imagination. It was a natural response to stress. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. By the time evening came, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I had to go home, and that meant walking past the park again. I tried to push the discomfort aside. The figure would probably be gone, or at least I wouldn't notice it anymore. I had to stop overthinking every little thing. I turned the corner toward the park and saw it. The figure was back in the same spot, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me. But this time, something was different. The figure seemed wrong. It wasn't just that it was motionless. There was something about the way it stood that felt unnatural. It wasn't just a person. It was a shape, a presence that didn't belong in the park, in the world. The way it stood, its posture, it was as if it were out of place, like it was existing in a space it didn't belong to. I glanced quickly away, determined not to stare. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt a strange weight in the air around me. It wasn't the normal evening quiet of the park. There was something else, something pulling at the edges of my mind. A faint whisper, so faint I thought I was imagining it. I paused, standing still for a moment, straining my ears. At first, it was nothing more than a soft hum, like wind rustling the leaves. But then it became clearer, distinct, yet incomprehensible. The voices seemed to come from all around me. The figure was silent, but the air around it, the whispers came from the space itself, from the very air I breathed. I felt my heart race. I quickly walked away, almost breaking into a jog, trying to shake the strange sensation that had settled in my chest. What had I just heard? Was it just my nerves? Or was something more happening? Something unseen? By the time I reached my apartment, I was out of breath, my mind swirling with confusion. But I tried to focus on something, anything else. I made dinner, sat down, turned on the TV. Anything to push the strange feeling away. But as I settled on the couch, I realized I wasn't alone in my thoughts. The whispers were still there, just beneath the surface. Barely audible, but there. I thought I heard something, a voice, or maybe just a word. I wasn't sure. My mind was racing, but I told myself it was just the stress. It had to be. You're imagining it. But then, as I tried to fall asleep that night, it got worse. The moment my eyes closed, I felt the shift. My body felt too heavy, like I was sinking. My thoughts turned sluggish, and my surroundings became hazy, as if I were no longer in my apartment, but somewhere else entirely. And then the whispers came again. This time, they were louder, more insistent, as if they were all around me, pressing in. It wasn't just that I could hear them. It felt like they were inside my head, like they were in me. You can hear us. We've been waiting. It's almost time. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my heart racing. I couldn't tell if I had been dreaming or awake. But I was terrified. It felt as if something had just crossed the boundary between the dream world and reality. The whispers hadn't been in my mind alone. They had been real, physical, invading my space. I could almost feel their cold breath on my skin, as if they were brushing past me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare. I was stressed, overtired, maybe even a bit delusional from lack of sleep. But that night was only the beginning. The next evening, I walked home again, my nerves stretched taut. I kept trying to rationalize what was happening, but it was getting harder. The closer I got to the park, the more I could feel that strange pull again, as if something was drawing me in, something I couldn't understand. There it was, standing in the same place, just like before. It felt like it was waiting for me, as if it knew I would be back. But this time, the whispers were already there, swirling around me, louder than ever, as if the very air itself was alive with them. I couldn't understand what they were saying. The words were jumbled, like a conversation from a distant room. I could make out parts of sentences, fragments of thoughts that seemed to be directed at me. You can't run. It's not a choice. We are always with you. I didn't stop walking, but the faster I walked, the more intense the whispers became. It was like I was being followed, but not physically. It was as if the presence of the figure, or whatever it was tethering itself to me, surrounding me in an unseen web of influence. I could hear it in my ears, inside my skull, in my thoughts. It was everywhere. I tried to block it out. I focused on the sound of my footsteps, the rustling leaves, anything that could pull me away from the maddening voices. But no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't leave. And when I reached my apartment, when I closed the door and locked it behind me, the voices didn't fade. They lingered, insistent, whispering in the corners of my mind. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I didn't know who or what I was screaming at. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the dark hallway from my dreams. The whispers were everywhere, clawing at my mind, urging me to listen. But I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to hear what they had to say. But I did. I couldn't stop myself. You can't escape. We are waiting. The next few days felt like I was living in a haze, as if reality itself was starting to slip away. The whispers had only gotten worse, haunting my every moment, slipping in between my thoughts like a constant, unseen presence. I couldn't shake them. It wasn't just at night anymore. They followed me throughout the day. The moment I closed my eyes, the voices would rise, becoming clearer, louder. The same insistent phrases like a chorus of lost souls, whispering in the back of my mind. You can't escape. You belong to us. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong, fleeting shapes that flickered at the edges of my vision, always too fast to fully grasp. I'd blink and they'd be gone, but the sense of unease didn't fade. It only grew. I'd catch glimpses of someone standing at the periphery of my sight, but when I looked directly, nothing was there. The world felt like it was shifting, warping just slightly, like it was bending under the weight of something unseen. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront it. I needed to know what was happening to me. Was I losing my mind? Was this a symptom of stress, of exhaustion? Or was something truly wrong, something I couldn't explain away with logic? I walked past the park again, my heart pounding, expecting to see the figure standing there. But this time, when I approached the familiar spot, there was no one. The figure wasn't there. For a fleeting moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it had all been my imagination after all. But as I walked deeper into the park, the whispering started again, not just in my mind, but all around me, in the trees, the air, the ground beneath my feet. I stopped dead in my tracks, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The voices were real. They weren't just thoughts. They were outside, surrounding me. You can't leave. You've been chosen. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing on the other side of the park, near the trees, motionless just like before. But this time, it wasn't at the edge of my vision. It was right there, and for the first time, I saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. There was nothing. A dark void, an absence of features, like staring into an endless, empty abyss. No eyes, no mouth, just a void, swallowing everything. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't advance, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence growing stronger by the second, like the pressure of the world itself was condensing around it. "It's time." The words, louder than ever, filled my head. But they weren't just inside my head. They were coming from the figure. I could feel it in the air, pressing down on me. Suddenly, the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of disjointed phrases, half-spoken words that I couldn't understand. They were all around me now, inescapable. I tried to move, but it was like the ground was pulling me in, rooting me to the spot. I finally forced myself to turn and run, my feet pounding the path, my heart thundering in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed. They filled the air, the earth beneath me, my very skin. I could feel them closing in, pressing in on me, like they were part of me, suffocating me with their demand to listen. I ran straight home that night, locked every door, every window, and collapsed on the couch, gasping for breath. My mind was spinning, unable to comprehend what was happening to me. How was this possible? Was I dreaming? Was I losing my mind? I had to be. There was no other explanation. But then, as I sat in my living room, staring at the walls, I felt a strange sensation, like I wasn't alone. It was as if the room itself was aware of my presence, closing in around me. The walls seemed to pulse, ever so slightly, as if breathing, and the air was heavy. I looked around, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. And then I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was clear, unmistakable. "We're inside you." The words cut through my mind like a blade. I jumped, the cold sweat instantly breaking out on my skin. I wasn't alone. Whatever this was, it wasn't in my head anymore. It wasn't something I could escape. It had crossed over. It was inside of me apartment now, inside my reality. I bolted to the window, yanked it open, and stared out at the night. The park was dark, as it always was at this hour, but I couldn't help but feel that, somewhere out there, the figure was watching me. I could feel its gaze even from this distance. I could feel its presence, the suffocating weight of it pressing down on me, filling the air. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that hallway from my dreams. The darkness closing in, the whispers getting louder, pressing against my eardrums, inside me, as if they were wrapping themselves around my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the void. When I woke up, the world felt different. I couldn't explain it, but everything seemed just off. The colors of the room felt muted, the air too thick, the sounds too far away. And as I moved through my morning routine, the whispers followed me, constant, unrelenting. I couldn't avoid them anymore. They weren't just in my head. They were everywhere. They were real. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that the figure had crossed over. It was no longer confined to the park or my dreams. It was here, in my world. It was waiting, and it was getting closer. The days blurred together in a way I couldn't explain. Every morning felt like I was waking up in a half-dream, caught between sleep and reality. The whispers had invaded every moment, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape them. They pressed in on me, growing louder, more insistent with each passing hour, like a slow, maddening tide that threatened to drown me. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind, a symptom of exhaustion or stress. That was all. The figure in the park had just been a trick of the light, my overactive imagination. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more real it became. The figure had become a constant presence in my life. It wasn't just standing in the park anymore. It had followed me home. It had infiltrated my thoughts, my very being. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there. The darkness would seep in, and I'd find myself back in that park, staring at the figure that had no face, that was made of shadows, standing motionless, waiting. It felt like the figure was pulling me in, urging me to come closer. It wanted something from me, something I couldn't quite grasp. I began to lose track of time. The minutes bled into hours, the hours into days, and I couldn't distinguish one from the other. I didn't know if it was day or night anymore. I didn't know how many hours I'd spent in my apartment, pacing, locked away from the outside world, trying to avoid the park, trying to avoid the thing that was stalking me. I couldn't bring myself to leave. The idea of stepping out into the world, into the dark streets where the whispers seemed to follow me, terrified me. One evening, I decided to go to the store. I couldn't stay locked in forever. Maybe I could break the cycle, pretend like I was normal again. But as I left my apartment and stepped into the hall, I froze. It was there, the figure. It wasn't in the park this time. It was standing in the doorway to my apartment building. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, shifting unnaturally, like it was drawing the light away from the hall, leaving only shadows in its wake. My heart slammed against my chest, and for a moment I thought I might faint. I couldn't breathe. My entire body was frozen, locked in place as I stared at the impossible thing standing before me. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure wasn't in front of me anymore. It was inside my mind, the same whispering voices filling my ears. You are ours. We've always been with you. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that I was still dreaming. But the chill in the air, the weight of something watching me, told me it was real. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The figure had crossed into my world, into my reality. I left my apartment anyway, driven by the need to escape, to feel like I had some control over my own life again. The streets were eerily quiet as I walked. Too quiet. The city, usually bustling with life, seemed muted, like it was holding its breath. And then I heard it. The whispers. They were softer at first, distant, but they grew louder with every step I took. They followed me, echoing around me, as if the city itself were alive with them. I tried to ignore it, to push it down, but I could feel them crawling under my skin. They were in me now, pressing against my thoughts, invading my mind. You can't outrun us. You can't escape. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. The quiet of the city seemed oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. I could feel eyes on me, but when I turned, no one was there. Not a soul in sight. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, became unbearable. I stopped at the corner, trying to steady myself. My breathing was shallow, my heart racing in my chest. The shadows seemed to twist around me, like they were reaching for me. I glanced down at the sidewalk, only to see something moving in the corner of my vision. It was a shadow. No, it was the figure, its dark form stretching across the pavement, moving with a slow, deliberate pace toward me. I tried to scream, to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. The figure reached me, but it didn't touch me. It didn't have to. The moment it was close enough, the whispers became deafening, flooding my mind with voices, countless voices, all speaking at once. You are ours. You cannot leave. The voices tore through my skull, as if they were trying to rip me apart from the inside. The pressure was unbearable. I could feel my mind fracturing under the weight of it, like I was being pulled apart and reassembled, my thoughts scattered, my body trembling. In the depths of my terror, I felt a presence behind me. Another figure. The whispers weren't just coming from one place. They were everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in on me like a cage. And then I realized, with a sickening certainty, that they weren't just following me. They had already taken me. The figure behind me reached out. Its hand was cold, impossibly cold, like it was made of the night itself. The darkness around it seemed to consume everything in its path, and I could feel it reaching into me, pulling my soul into the void. The moment it touched my shoulder, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. I don't know how much time passed. But when I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, but everything was different. The air felt wrong, like it had been warped. The room looked the same, yet everything had a distorted, unnatural quality to it. The whispers had stopped, but something else had taken their place. The silence now felt oppressive, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered, stretched thin. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, and I tried to stand, but my body felt heavy, as if something was holding me down. And then, through the silence, I heard it. A voice, clear and cold. Welcome home. I looked around, but no one was there. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, as if the very space around me was becoming something else, something that didn't belong in this world. I wasn't alone anymore. The figure, the whispers, whatever they were, had taken me. I had crossed over to their world, and there was no way back. That it's hard to describe what it feels like when your world starts to crack. When the boundaries between what's real and what's imagined begin to blur, and you realize that your mind can't be trusted anymore. That was where I was now. My once orderly life had become a nightmare. My waking hours filled with the same whispers, the same figure, always watching, always waiting. The presence wasn't just in the park anymore. It was with me everywhere I went. I could feel it in the air when I walked down the street, lurking behind every corner. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. The whispers followed me into every room, curling into my thoughts like tendrils, whispering their cold, insistent words. You are ours. You've always been ours. I tried to fight it at first, tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was succumbing to stress or exhaustion. But after a week of sleepless nights, of feeling constantly hunted, I realized something worse. It wasn't just in my head. This thing, whatever it was real, and it had followed me here. I thought I was losing my mind, that I was breaking down, but the feeling was too tangible, too persistent to be dismissed. It felt like I was being suffocated by it, as if my very thoughts weren't mine anymore. Every night, I'd hear the whispers just as I was about to fall asleep, their words shifting, growing clearer, more urgent, more forceful. You will not escape. You belong to us. I began to stop leaving the apartment altogether. I couldn't risk it. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel it waiting. The figure, the whispers, the presence that had wormed its way into every part of my life. And when I stayed inside, it didn't help either. The walls of my apartment began to feel like they were closing in. It was as if the very space itself was alive with the presence of that thing. I could feel its eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. I could feel it moving just beyond my sight. Every night, the darkness in my room seemed to stretch, becoming thicker, more oppressive. It felt like something was waiting in the shadows, something impossibly still. I could hear its breathing, a slow, steady rhythm, as if it was right beside me, watching. It wasn't just an image in my mind. I could feel it, creeping along the edges of my vision. And every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it in my head, calling to me, pressing its cold fingers against my thoughts. I could feel myself becoming unraveled. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant pressure of knowing that something was lurking just beyond my reach. I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten a full meal, or even left the apartment. I couldn't focus, couldn't think. It was like my mind was becoming clouded with something darker, something I couldn't push away. It was one particular evening when it all came crashing down. I was pacing around the apartment, unable to sit still, feeling the walls pressing in on me, the air growing thick, suffocating. The whispers were deafening now. They no longer came from just inside my head. They were everywhere. In the corners of the room, in the rustling of the curtains, in the very silence that stretched around me. I had to leave. I couldn't stand it any longer. I couldn't stay here. The figure, whatever it was, had already crossed the boundary into my reality. It wasn't just something I could ignore. It was in me, wrapped around my mind like a cold, unyielding presence. I had to escape it, or it would consume me completely. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, desperate to put some distance between myself and whatever was following me. But as I stepped into the hall, I felt it again. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight. The whispers, and the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, expecting to see something. Anything. But there was only the long, empty corridor. No one. No figure. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, and burst out into the street. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but even that couldn't clear the fog in my mind. I felt like I was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to keep moving. I walked aimlessly, turning down streets I didn't recognize, hoping that somehow I could outrun whatever had invaded my life. But it didn't work. The figure wasn't in the park anymore. It wasn't just in my apartment. It was everywhere. The whispers followed me through the streets, growing louder with each passing step, as though they were emanating from the very buildings, from the concrete beneath my feet. You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. I felt the pressure of it all around me. Every shadow seemed to twist, to stretch, to turn into the same dark figure I had seen in the park. Every person I passed felt like they were watching me. Even the lights seemed too bright, too harsh, as if they were drawing attention to me, as if everything was conspiring against me. And then it happened. I was walking down a dark alley when I saw it. The figure, standing at the far end, its featureless face staring straight at me. It wasn't just standing still this time. It was moving, its body jerking, twitching in unnatural ways, as if it was pulling itself into my reality from some other world. The whispers flooded my ears again, louder than ever, all of them at once. My knees gave out, and I collapsed to the ground. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was like my mind was being ripped apart, dragged into a place where there were no rules, no sense of time or logic. And then I heard it, the voice. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a deep, resonating command that cut through the madness. It's time. The ground beneath me seemed to open up, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, dragged by the force of the voice, the presence, the figure that was no longer just a shadow, but something tangible, real. I couldn't fight it anymore. It had me, and as it pulled me deeper, I knew that whatever it was, whatever had been stalking me, had won. There was no escape. I was no longer a person. I was just another soul trapped in the dark, another voice lost to the whispers. And it was only the beginning.